Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out this evening. Thought we'd get started a while with some announcements. Just a reminder that this program is being recorded and will be available on the York County History Center YouTube channel. We have a lot of programming coming up right now. On June 4th, our Writers Roundtable speaker is Peter Mealy. How do you say your name? Mealy. I said it right. Okay. Very good. He'll be speaking about revolutionaries on the river. June 4th through 6th, we have our Book Blast fundraiser, which is always a lot of fun at our Agricultural Industrial Museum. On June 13th, second Saturday, is a program called When the Declaration of Independence Was News. It's a book by author Emily Sneff, who will be here speaking. June 14th, our Genealogy Society program is the Henry James Young Awards. And July 1st is the donor and member opening reception for our new exhibit, Revolutionary York, with an evening public opening on July 3rd. So July 1st, members and donors, July 3rd, open to the public. For more updates, please visit yorkhistorycenter.org. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the main meeting of the Roundtable. I just want to thank everyone attending in person and online. Just a quick reminder before we get to tonight's program that next month is our last meeting before our summer vacation of July and August, and then we'll resume in September. But just to give everyone a heads up for that for upcoming programs. Before we get to tonight's program, though, just going to give a preview of next month. Next month on June 17th, we'll be welcoming local historian, Roundtable favorite Jim McClure. And he'll be discussing how the American Revolution intersected with the Civil War in York and Adams County, Part 2. He says that all roads led to York County, and the county is the center of the universe. No doubt you'd be hard-pressed to find another county north of the Mason-Dixon line with American Revolution and Civil War stories as rich. 250th anniversaries of the Declaration of Independence and Articles of Confederation give us an opportunity to look at connections between the two wars spaced out only about 85 years. Jim McClure will present about military, historical, cultural, and political connections between the two history-shaping eras in York County and national history. This is a follow-up to his presentation last year, when he will summarize Part 1 as a lead into the Part 2 next month. Jim McClure is a retired editor of the York Daily Record and Sunday News, after serving in leadership positions at the news organization for more than 30 years. In that time, he also served as USA Today's network state editor for Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Maryland, overseeing 6 daily newsrooms. He was senior on-site editor for coverage of some major events, the Sandy Hook Elementary School Massacre in Newtown, Connecticut, Boston Marathon bombing, among others. He's also the author or co-author of 10 books on York County history, including works on the American Revolution, Civil War, and World War II. In 2025, he was inducted into the Pennsylvania News Media Association Hall of Fame. He also partners with Jamie Norpel and Dominique Miller and the streaming of YouTube series Hometown History. Tonight, we welcome Codie Eash. He serves as the Director of Education and Interpretation at Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center on the historic campus of the Lutheran Seminary in Gettysburg, where he served several roles since 2012. He earned his undergraduate in communication and journalism at Shippensburg University in 2014. He's currently working on his master's in American history at Gettysburg College. In addition to museum tours and interpretation, Codie lectures for the American Battlefield Trust, National Park Service sites, Civil War roundtables like ours, libraries, and other community organizations. Tonight, he is going to tell us about the election of 1864, talking about The nation shall live and slavery shall die. So let's welcome Codie.
Well, thank you, Scott. Thanks, Nicole. Thanks, Kathy. Thanks, everybody here at the York History Center and the York Civil War Roundtable. Pete and I are on this fun trend right now where he was the speaker for the roundtable last week, and I was introduced, sitting in the audience, and now I'm speaking tonight, and he's getting introduced for the Writers Roundtable next month. So it's a fun trend.
We can't escape. We can't escape each other.
Can't escape each other, exactly. And for context, Pete and I worked together for a long time, for those who might be unaware, his role at Seminary Ridge prior to his role now in Susquehanna National Heritage Area. Also, speaking of Jim McClure, I was going to mention this later, but it's a good segue. If anybody's interested, and we're gonna talk about nationally the election of 1864, but there will be some ties, especially toward the end of our time, to how the election or takes place, I should say, in York, and how York County and York Borough, before it's York City, York Borough in 1864 is affected. In a book that I had the privilege of writing a foreword to, that Jim McClure and Scott Mingus co-wrote, The Dogs of War in Our Midst, Civil War Perspectives from York County, Pennsylvania. There's an essay in here that Scott Mingus wrote on the Civil War politics of York County. So if you're interested, take a look at this book for all of the wonderful contributions inside of it, but ties directly into how York and York County are voting and thinking about political matters of the Civil War. And we're going to touch on that toward the end of our time to sort of localize the events of the election of 1864. I always like to start this talk by talking just a bit about how I sort of started thinking about why the election of 1864 matters the way that it does. As we'll see in a moment, it has been well written about. It's one of our most written about and studied presidential elections, and for good reason. And where my mind always goes when I think about this electoral contest is my first presidential election in which I participated was 2012. Of course, Barack Obama against Republican challenger Mitt Romney. And I would have turned 18 just the year before, so it's the first time I had a chance to vote in a presidential election. I was then a sophomore at Shippensburg University. And I remember that in United Campus Ministry, a campus Bible study, we were having a discussion, and we were either sharing articles or discussing op-eds, something along those lines. And one always stuck out to me by a reporter named Brian Roberts. And for the life of me, I've tried to find this article online when I'm referencing it, and I can't find it anywhere. But I know the reporter's name was Brian Roberts. Can't remember what outlet he wrote for, but the name always stuck in my head because it's the same as the longtime Baltimore Orioles second baseman, a favorite childhood baseball player of mine. I don't think it was the same Brian Roberts. But there's this line that has always stuck with me, where Roberts said, "We always say this is the most important election in our nation's history, and we need to stop saying that. It's something that we all do every single election." He says, "We always do that." Then he corrects it, and he says, "The most important election in our nation's history is when Abraham Lincoln became president. Before that, we thought it was okay to own people." And that, of course, is oversimplifying a lot of complex matters of history. But it really does get to the heart of the matter, that not all elections are created equal. In the moment, the campaigns and pundits, and even we as voters, we feel that way and think that way. And in hindsight, some of those elections do become among the most important in our nation's history. And we could strike up an argument for what exactly that short list of most important elections ever would be. But certainly among those, we would have to say 1860, and a close second, or maybe edging it out for first, is 1864. One of those elections brings about the most cataclysmic period in American history. But of course, with that, we get the end of the original sin as a result of that cataclysmic event of the American Civil War that comes about as a result of secession, which comes about as a result of 1860. But the fruits of that labor of 4 years that had passed since 1860 to make some sense out of all of the death, all of the destruction that had taken place, that's going to come about because of what happens in 1864. And so that's sort of the lens through which we're going to look at this. We're also going to see that a major theme is this election is particularly remarkable because it happened at all. This is the election that, if ever there was one in our nation's history, where the federal government, the executive branch, could have said that it was a situation so unnatural, a situation that was so devastating, that was so destructive, that was so dangerous, that we couldn't possibly have an election go off freely and fairly, this would have been it. But as we'll see, it happens, and nobody really even gives that a second thought until after the fact, that there was this idea up in the air that it may not have happened at all. And there aren't many cases where this could have happened, but our 1864 election in the United States has a distinction in world history, in all of human history. There has never been, except for this one, a republic that held an election in the middle of the Civil War. This is the one and only example that we ever have of that. And we can see that the people who lived through it realized they were living through an absolutely historic moment. And so going back to that Brian Roberts line, you need to stop saying this is the most important election in our nation's history. Well, the people of 1864, they certainly could have said it, and I think rightfully so. Now, of course, we're here on the couple of days before Memorial Day, which we'll commemorate next week. And Memorial Day is a moment where we can stop and think about the fact that one of the ways we're able to have elections at all is as a result of the sacrifice of soldiers on battlefields. And so Kathy asked if I would take a few moments at the beginning to make a tie-in to Memorial Day. And as soon as she asked me that, I had the perfect tie-in. This is a photograph taken right here in York at the U.S. Army General Hospital at Penn Park, as we know it today, or the Civil War Memorial stands. The U.S. Army General Hospital is there for basically the whole middle period of the war. There are patients there as a result of the Battle of Antietam, and many of those patients will join in the defense of Wrightsville in June of 1863. And the man who, for a time, served as the chaplain of the York General Hospital was the Reverend Dr. James Allen Brown. Now, Brown was himself a veteran of the Civil War. Even before he was a chaplain of the York General Hospital, he was the chaplain of the 87th Pennsylvania Infantry, a unit that has deep York and Adams County ties. He's a native of Lancaster, who, at the time of the secession crisis, finds himself presiding over Newberry College in Newberry, South Carolina. But he's a proud Union man, and as soon as he learns that it seems as though South Carolina will declare secession, he goes back to Pennsylvania, ends up enlisting as the chaplain of the 87th Pennsylvania, and then is called upon here in York to serve as the chaplain of the York General Hospital. In 1868, on Cemetery Hill at Soldiers National Cemetery in Gettysburg, 5 years after the Battle of Gettysburg, 3 years after the American Civil War, May 30th, 1868 will be the first National Memorial Day, or what was originally known as Decoration Day. Now, there are many contested origins of how Memorial Day became the tradition that it is today, but the first time it's an officially declared national holiday is by John Logan, a veteran of the Civil War, a U.S. Army general, who is going to issue a declaration. And with that declaration, we're going to see that all around the country, especially veterans, especially towns that have cemeteries where the newly interred dead of the American Civil War, soldiers who fell in defense of the Republic, in defense of the United States, we're going to see many of the same things we would do today. There's a parade with veterans and children and bands, and they're usually going to end up meeting at either a Veterans Memorial Hall or at a cemetery. And in Gettysburg, of course, we're going to have this extraordinarily high-profile community that witnessed the worst of the American Civil War. And Dr. Brown is going to be chosen as the keynote speaker at the dedication, at the cemetery in Gettysburg. So a couple of years ago, I produced a video for Seminary Ridge Museum, which looks at Brown's speech. It's a pretty short oration, lasts about 4 minutes altogether. So I thought a great tie-in that ties in York, where he had served as the chaplain of the General Hospital, Gettysburg, where we'll see in a moment, he has a direct connection as well, and this idea of Memorial Day in 1868, which is in itself the next presidential election year that takes place after 1864. This runs just about 4 minutes. You're going to hear me in stereo here. It's my voice that is narrating. But this is the speech that Dr. James Allen Brown delivers at Gettysburg's first Memorial Day, May 30th, 1868. There's no audio for the first few seconds.
We have come to do honor to the noble dead, to strew with flowers the graves of those who died, that we and the nation might live. We have come not in midwinter or with cypress wreaths, but in springtime, when the fields are green and the flowers blooming and birds singing, that in sympathy with universal nature, we might bring our grateful offering of reverence and affection. 7 years ago, and hundreds of thousands, who now sleep in soldiers' graves, were pursuing their peaceful avocations at home. When their country called, they left home and loved ones to uphold their country's flag and their country's honor. As they heartily bade farewell, they were assured that they would be cherished at home. And if any left children behind, they should be the children of the Republic. Here on this hill, they met the hosts of rebellion and treason, and here thousands laid down their lives for freedom and the Union. The price of their death was victory and safety for us and the nation. The pledges given to the noble soldiers of the Union, we have now come to fulfill, to keep alive their mourners and strew with flowers their graves. Their orphan children, the representatives of 500,000, would strew these flowers upon the graves of their fathers, and the nation would recognize them as their own. The noble dead, who fell here and on these neighboring hills, need no eulogium from our lips. They have secured the proudest of all earthly honors, and their tombstones bear this inscription: they died for their country. There is no danger that they will be forgotten. They live in the hearts of more than 20 millions of citizens of this great republic, from all sections of the land, from across the ocean, and from the isles of the sea. Do pilgrims visit this hallowed spot? Not only soldiers and comrades in arms, but statesmen and patriots, gray hairs and tender youth, young men and maidens come, and will continue to come. These flowers to be strewn tell that their death was beautiful and fragrant. It is noble and beautiful thus to die for one's country, and the whole land is fragrant with the odor of their heroic deeds. The blessings of peace and prosperity which we enjoy, they have secured for us. Ours is a debt of gratitude, which no words or actions can ever express. But long as the Union lasts, and may it be perpetual, let a grateful people visit their resting place. Strew flowers, sweet flowers, on the soldiers' graves. For the death they died, the nation saves. 'Tis sweet and glorious thus to die. Hallowed the spot where their ashes lie.
James Allen Brown, as you might have picked up in the opening lines of text there, when he delivers that, is the president of the Gettysburg Lutheran Seminary. He leaves his post here at the York General Hospital and has been asked in 1864, as the Civil War is still ongoing, after the retirement of Samuel Simon Schmucker, the seminary's founder and first president, if he would take up the mantle as its second. While he's in that role, that he is going to be tasked with delivering that brief but eloquent set of words that gives us a sense of how he was thinking, the nation was thinking, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania was thinking about what this occasion meant. So Memorial Day, and it's of course a tradition that we've now continued on for more than 150 years, and we'll continue to do so next Monday. But a good reminder of the occasion. Thanks, Kathy, for asking me to put something together. You can find that video on YouTube if you just look on the Seminary Ridge Museum YouTube channel, or if you search for Gettysburg's first Memorial Day. I did a program talking about the whole day, but then that shorter form video with his speeches there. Now, of course, the building that is the centerpiece of the Gettysburg Seminary when he resides over it and throughout its history is today's Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center. It's many familiar faces here this evening, so I don't have to say much about the museum, but we're, of course, housed in the original building on the campus of the Gettysburg Seminary. Talk about the first day of battle in and around the seminary campus. The story of the building is used as a hospital for 2.5 months after the battle. and the story of faith and freedom in the context of 19th century America and how those issues affected Gettysburg and South Central Pennsylvania for that matter as a whole. We have a lot coming up. I have some flyers up here on the table, so at the end of our time, feel free to grab anything you'd like to there. When you come into the museum, the segue into our topic for this evening, go back to the election of 1864. One of the very first things that you see, and a through line throughout the exhibits, is the Gettysburg Address, images of Lincoln, really getting a sense of the feel that the president, the 16th president, and his leadership during time of war is right there as a central theme of how we think about the American Civil War. Of course, he's the quintessential figure of the 19th century and certainly of the Civil War era. We're confronted with that as soon as we step into this historic building. When we think about when Lincoln was in Gettysburg, November 1863, there are a number of books that talk about the election of 1864. And really the first big one is not until 1997. It's John Waugh's re-electing Lincoln. And at the beginning of the book, John Waugh talks about the fact that there's this question of where do we begin this story of 1864? When did the campaign really begin? Because when we think about our presidential election campaigns today, we would ask ourselves, when do the campaigns really begin? Usually it's about 2 years out that we have candidates who are declaring their candidacy. It's soon after the midterm elections. But for all intents and purposes, it's the moment after a president is inaugurated. There's always talk, of course, of who will run 3.5 years from that point. But when it comes to the election of 1864, many people point to the Gettysburg Address, to Lincoln's presence in Gettysburg, as something of an opening campaign speech. Now, of course, it had a very literal purpose, did his remarks at the dedication of the National Cemetery. It was a funereal occasion. But there is, of course, a call to action for the people of the United States. At that point in time, we can see that Lincoln is no longer really identifying as a Republican anymore. He's identifying as a member of the Union Party. And I think that that's a good place that we can really kind of begin to start thinking about how Lincoln and other Republicans, Union Party members, liberal Democrats, there's of course many former Whigs and moderate members of the new Republican Party, they're starting to think about, A, will Lincoln be at the top of the ticket in a year? But then also, where do we go with this war? What is the purpose of this war? We can see, of course, some of those themes right here in South Central Pennsylvania when Lincoln talks about a new birth of freedom, for instance. We can endlessly try to interpret what literally did he mean by that. We can start to see that we're forming a policy position for the election of 1864. And it really sort of stands on two legs. Prosecute the war to its end and defeat the Confederacy with that, and end slavery. No longer just freeing enslaved people as a war measure through the Emancipation Proclamation, but end the institution that enslaved those people. And those become the two big standing points for the Republican or Union Party going into 1864. Others more recently have written on the election of 1864. We have the Decided on the Battlefield there, the second book from the left-hand side, which, all these are relatively recent in the grand scheme of things. That comes out in 2012. David Allen Johnson is the author of it. Jonathan White's Emancipation, the Union Army, and the re-election of Abraham Lincoln really ties in the story of soldiers on the battlefield, which becomes a major component of Lincoln's electorate, as we'll see here in a little bit. That's a body of the electorate that he thinks he's going to lose because the man he's running against used to command them. But ultimately, he will end up earning about 75% of their support. And then more recently, in 2023, George Rabel's Conflict of Command looks at this relationship between George McClellan, the Democratic candidate, and Lincoln's former general-in-chief, and Lincoln himself. So each of these takes sort of a different tact to how it's looking at the election from left to right. You're looking at the election as a whole, the election in the intersection of a war, the election through the eyes of soldiers, and the election through the eyes of the two main candidates in the course of their civil wars. Any of these I would highly recommend if you're interested in learning more about this. But we can see this is an event that has been really well covered over time. But I would say that our greatest chronicler of the Civil War, as far as someone who didn't live through it, but who wrote about it the most eloquently, Bruce Catton is right up there, for my money, as the best writer of the Civil War ever. And just within the past couple of days, I realized that I had never really gone back and looked at how did Catton look at this election. I thought that would be a really good place for us to dive into the heart of this story. because he takes these moments, and anybody who's ever read Bruce Catton, you'll be familiar with this. He takes these moments, these turning points, these pivot points, and he just so eloquently states them in ways that almost no one ever has. So looking at how he treats the election of 1864 in 4 books here, I'm just going to share some brief excerpts. A favorite historian of mine, David Blight, he gave a lecture one time where he talks about how it's dangerous to start quoting from Bruce Catton because then the rest of your talk is just you quoting Bruce Catton. But I won't do that. But take a couple of excerpts from these. A Stillness in Appomattox, for which Catton earned the Pulitzer Prize in 1953. He says this, and he looks at in that book through the context of soldiers on the battlefield. Talking things over, veterans agreed that they had been a better, stronger army in 1862, when George McClellan commanded, than they were now in 1864 under Ulysses S. Grant. Yet, they also agreed that if Grant had commanded in 1862, the war would have been won in that year, while if McClellan had commanded in 1864, he would have ended the war by establishing the Confederacy. And so, when election day came, the veterans voted by resounding majorities against McClellan, spoiler alert, voted for Lincoln and for war to the bitter end, and voting so swung shut forever a door into their own past. George McClellan had commanded these men, many of them beloved. He was beloved by many of them, but they overwhelmingly will support their commander-in-chief to want to see the end of this war and those things for which they had fought now for more than 3 years. In this hallowed ground, which is Catton's overall history of the Civil War in 1956, he looks more at the citizenry, the average voter. How is this election impacting them? The war had gone on for more than 3 years. It had touched every family circle in America. Every isolated farm, every peaceful village, and every great city knew perfectly well what names like Stones River and Chickamauga and Cold Harbor meant. And by now, many folk were wondering if the terrible price they were paying was really going to buy what they wanted. The great struggles of history are not always visible and dramatic. They can take place out of sight, in the hearts and minds of millions of men who have a choice to make. It went thus in 1864. The final word about the Civil War would be spoken by the people back home, most of whom had never seen a battlefield, carried a musket, or known what it was like to watch pain and death take form in the red-gray mist of smoke and flame. Out of what they felt, the choice would come. In 1965, a Never Call Retreat, was the second of Catton's trilogies. He said the war was an exercise in violence, bounded by 2 presidential elections. Takes a look at the political meaning of this election. One of those elections had brought the war on, and another would help to end it. The election of 1860 indicated the great change was coming to a society that could endure no change. And yet there was an appeal to arms from that finding. Now in 1864, there was going to be a new election to determine whether the appeal should be sustained or denied. No matter what the election said, the mere fact that it was being held was significant. It was an act of faith, an affirmation that even war itself must at last be subject to a decision reached at the polls. Perhaps the strangest thing about this strangest of all elections was that it never occurred to anyone to not have it. Whether any nation so conceived and so dedicated could long endure, well, they would vote. And lastly, when Grant takes command in 1968, just 10 years before Catton died, he said this election, in the middle of a civil war and its aftermath, had gone so quickly, so much like any previous election, as if the country knew that it was going to go on electing presidents and accepting the electoral verdicts for all time to come. Now, how about these candidates? Let's bring these candidates up to the moment where they run against one another. By and large, among the Civil War audience, neither needs a terribly long introduction, but just for context's sake, let's put them on this collision course. These are the first 2 photographs ever taken of these men. Lincoln here, taken in 1846 or 47 during his 1 term in Congress from 1846 to 48, coinciding with the years of the Mexican-American War. Of course, born in Kentucky, raised in Indiana, lives most of his life in Illinois, runs for an Illinois state seat, ultimately is really going to move to the national political scene in 1854. This Peoria speech in the aftermath of the Dred Scott decision makes him a major anti-slavery Whig, a across the United States. That's sort of his rebirth after his one-term, relatively quiet term in Congress. That'll set him on the pace then to have the famous U.S. senatorial race against Stephen Douglas, and a famous series of debates. Loses that election, but that's going to put him on a fast track in 1860 to at least be a consideration for this brand new anti-slavery Republican Party. Whenever Lincoln is nominated, it's somewhat by surprise, and of course, many of those people who he defeats in the Republican National Convention, he's going to put those people into his cabinet not there long after. That gets us basically the greatest hits, of course, of Lincoln's life would be going on. This down here, this is the first photograph ever taken of George McClellan. This is whenever he's about to leave to go to Mexico. He's with his father up here and his sister down here. This photograph, coincidentally, is taken about the same time as the photograph of Lincoln. So these are taken within about a year of one another. But midst of the Mexican War, George McClellan, this young up-and-coming officer, graduate of West Point, serves in Mexico and then goes to Europe and is an observer in the Crimean War, comes back to the United States, is still young, is in his 30s, the outbreak of the Civil War. He's going to be seen as a man who is almost single-handedly to be given credit for keeping the western side of Virginia, what becomes the state of West Virginia in 1863 in the Union, has a heavy role in making sure that these possibly secessionist elements of the South are kept loyal to the Union. And that's going to put him as a major figure on the radar to command all the armies. And when he's made general-in-chief, he's replacing a man in the form of Winfield Scott, who is in his 70s. George McClellan's in his 30s. Winfield Scott had been in the Army for 40-something years by this point. A great way to think about this is that Winfield Scott was in the Army for more years than George McClellan was alive. And so that's going to be this figure who oftentimes we see as sort of the butt of jokes of the Civil War. George McClellan is an extraordinarily accomplished man. Now, it doesn't make him particularly likable, as anybody who has read about George McClellan knows about George McClellan can attest. But we can really see that his star is on the rise whenever he's made general-in-chief of all United States armies. We're going to see it at first as a relatively successful relationship when Lincoln appoints George McClellan as commander of all federal forces. But then, of course, we're going to see that McClellan has what Lincoln will refer to famously as a case of the slows, consistently overemphasizing the number of troops that are in front of him without any real evidence. A major through line of George McClellan's career, and it plays a major role in 1864, is that he just believes anything anyone tells him if he trusts that person even remotely. And he starts to trust many of the wrong people as time goes on, and he can be very, very easily swayed. But Lincoln is going to credit McClellan, as many of the soldiers who fought under him did as well, with really creating this behemoth of an army, the Army of the Potomac. And without George McClellan's leadership at the moment that he led it, one could make the argument that this army will not become the success that it does in the years that follow. And we're starting to see a bit of a revision of the George McClellan historiography, and especially in the context of the Maryland campaign and the Battle of Antietam, where, of course, this photograph is taken near Sharpsburg, Maryland, at the Grove Farm in October 1862. But we can look no further than the fact that Lincoln fires George McClellan from this job twice to understand that these men never really will see each other on the same plane. I didn't mention before, but I should have, is that they had actually, their paths had crossed in Illinois as well before the Civil War. George McClellan had served as the vice president and an engineer on the Illinois Central Railroad when Lincoln was riding the legal circuit, young in his political career. And George McClellan will write, even back in the 1830s, 40s, that he felt that this was a backwoods, bumbling idiot who will never become a national political figure. And of course, we see George McClellan writing many of those same things, even when Lincoln is his commander-in-chief, and he is the general-in-chief, calling him things like the original guerrilla, ignoring him whenever they're slated to have meetings with one another. It's just very much this allyship at first that becomes quite adversarial quite quickly. George McClellan is going to be relieved from Army command fully and never returned to it November 5th, 1862. This scene is from November 10th around Warrenton, Virginia, when he's saying goodbye to the Army for the final time. Much to the lament of many of these soldiers, despite him not being very popular with the Lincoln administration or with many Republicans in Congress or many newspaper editors around the country. Soldiers really did, by and large, look up to George McClellan. And we can see that reflected in many of their writings as he's leaving the Army, as well as their excitement in 1863 and even after, when there are rumors that McClellan is going to be returned to command, such as in the midst of the Gettysburg campaign at the end of June 1863. McClellan really exits stage right for the rest of the Civil War, other than the election of 1864. He essentially goes home to New Jersey, is still an active member of the United States Army up until the election, and is essentially told, wait for your next orders, your next command. And those simply never come. And so we don't really see George McClellan, of course, on a Civil War battlefield for the remainder of the conflict. But it's while he's sort of brewing about what his next move will be, that he's going to be approached by members of the Democratic Party. George McClellan does not seek out the Democratic nomination. That's a pretty common misnomer that we see, is that he's hungry for the presidency even when he's in command of the U.S. Army. That's not the case. George McClellan becomes especially persuaded by members of the Democratic Party. And one of the people who is going to sort of nudge against him to say, I don't think that you should go about this, is going to have family members, including his brother-in-law, who tell him, George, you're extremely impressionable. I hope you realize that people can persuade you to do and say anything. I don't know if it's in your best interest to become the Democratic candidate for president. Now, by and large, George McClellan is aligned with Democrats. He's very conservative in an era when the Democratic Party is the conservative party on the left-right spectrum. He doesn't approve of emancipation, a great irony, given the fact that it's his victory at the Battle of Antietam that opens the door to the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, one of the great ironies of the American Civil War. And so by and large, he's going to be someone who certainly would support the Democratic Party's choice for president. But his big hangup, as we'll see when we look at the platforms here in a moment, is that the Democratic Party has essentially staked its claim on the fact that they feel the war is a failure. And George McClellan, as a man who was in command for an entire calendar year almost of that war, he can't rightfully, in his eyes, sign on to that idea that this war was a failure. How can he look in the faces of those hundreds of thousands of soldiers who he commanded and tell them that everything that they did was in vain? And so he's going to be a reluctant candidate, ultimately. We also can see that this election is taking place against the backdrop of scenes like these. This one in particular is a famous photograph from Cold Harbor. This event, the Battle of Cold Harbor, is taking place literally as the Republican Party, or the newly branded Union Party, is holding its convention. And so when we think about the uphill battle for the Lincoln administration, we're no longer in the heyday of victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg in July 1863, when the star is turning toward the Union cause and Lincoln's cause by extension. We're at a very dark period by this point in time. The battles of the Wilderness and Spotsylvania, North Anna, Cold Harbor have now given way to the siege of Petersburg. And we're going to see that most theaters of action have sort of come to a standstill. The butcher's bill is going to climb ever and ever higher. And these are the scenes that people are seeing in their newspapers and at local photography studios. So it's June 7th and 8th, just a couple, in the midst of all of this, that the Republican Party, newly branded, I have it in quotes there, it's the National Union Party, is going to hold its convention. Let's talk a bit about what exactly its platform was. This is going to be held in Baltimore. The Democratic Convention is in Chicago a couple of months later. They didn't take place very close to one another, almost 2 months apart between the two of these. And this would have been, for all intents and purposes, in June 1864, when most Americans are starting to pay attention to the presidential campaign. It's only going to be the last few months before the election itself, unlike today, where it's that years-long cycle. So the platform is written by Henry Raymond, who was the editor of the New York Times. Today, we live in an era when we can see, time and again, we feel as though we have extraordinarily partisan press. We don't have anything quite like that, though, where literally the editor-in-chief of a newspaper is writing a party platform. We can see just how much in 19th century American life, whatever newspaper you're carrying under your arm is going to tell people everything that they need to know about you as far as where you stand on the political spectrum. But there are several points to the platform. I'm not going to go over them all in depth, but I just want to pull out an excerpt from each of them to give us a sense of what is the Republican Party standing for in 1864. The first one is to do everything in our power to aid the government and quelling by force of arms the rebellion. So first point of business, end the war. Do everything we can to try to end this war. The second is to prosecute the war with the utmost possible vigor to the complete suppression of the rebellion. So not just to end the war, but defeat the Confederacy. Make sure that those who are in rebellion have been totally defeated. That before we welcome them back into the country, we can hope that we're pursuing a course so that this can't happen again. The third is an amendment to the Constitution that shall terminate and forever prohibit the existence of slavery. It's the first time in American history that a national political party, as a stance in its platform, has officially put that down on paper and said we're going to have an amendment to end slavery. And again, this is an important point that's different than emancipating enslaved people. Freeing enslaved people, the Emancipation Proclamation could do because of its war measure. But now we need an amendment to actually end that institution. The fourth is a provision for survivors who have received disabling and honorable wounds in the service of the country. This is the only tenet that both parties will have as a member of their platforms, is we have to look out for the soldiers, as Lincoln would call them later, the widows and orphans of this war, in addition to the soldiers themselves. We have to do something to help them. The fifth is Abraham Lincoln has discharged the great duties and responsibilities of the presidential office. Now, it may seem obvious that Lincoln's name is mentioned as a tenet in the platform, but as we'll see in a moment, when they go into the convention, it's not a foregone conclusion that Lincoln is going to be their candidate. So it's important that they put this in there to put that case to rest, that Lincoln is the guy going forward. The sixth is we deem it essential to the general welfare that harmony should prevail. They're looking to the future and saying, we're talking an awful lot here about war, suppression of rebellion. Our end goal, ultimately, in addition to the end of slavery, is a reunification of the country. Peace, harmony should prevail. I'll put a note here briefly. If anybody has not read it yet but is interested in Lincoln, a recent scholarship from Matthew Pinsker, Boss Lincoln, The Partisan Life of Abraham Lincoln. For my money, it's one of the more significant new additions to the Lincoln historiography we've had in quite some time. He really hits on this idea that this is not just, as it's oftentimes been perceived, by myself included, as a temporary rebrand from Republican to National Union, but this was really, for Lincoln's sake, for many people around him, this was a completely new identity that this party that they were going for, and he makes a really sound case of it there. So I won't go into depth on that, but felt it was worth mentioning. There are a few more points here in the platform, and this is Henry Raymond, by the way, the editor of the New York Times, who wrote the platform. The seventh point is the government owes to all men employed in its armies, without regard to distinction of color, the full protection of the laws of war. Pretty radical as well for its time. This is the first time a major political party, one of the two major at any point in time, has said something like this. And it comes about because 1864 is full of these racial massacres in places like Olustee in Florida, Fort Pillow in Tennessee. Last time I was here to speak last year, I talked about Lincoln's sanitary fair speeches of 1864, which are taking place this same spring and summer. And the news of Fort Pillow, this massacre of United States colored troops in Tennessee, all of these things are top of mind. And Lincoln and the party want to make sure that they're giving full protection of the law to Black soldiers. The eighth tenet is that foreign immigration should be fostered and encouraged by a liberal and just policy. This is an interesting thing that we can see consistently throughout the Republican or Union Party platform, is the use of the term liberal. And if we look throughout the Democratic platform, we consistently see the term conservative. It's a good reminder of the fact that there's been realignments throughout our American political system. Of course, that'll happen again in the Roosevelt era, the FDR era. It'll happen again during the Lyndon Johnson era, all these realignments. But the very use of terms like liberal and conservative are flipped compared to how we would think of them today. And on this point, it has to do with immigration. The ninth is that we are in favor of the speedy construction of a railroad to the Pacific coast. A reminder that though the American Civil War is the most important thing happening in the United States, it's not the only thing happening in the United States. The Transcontinental Railroad is being planned. The Homestead Act, it's not mentioned here, but has taken place during this point in time. Land grant acts. And so we can start to see that there are these other major policy positions that are taking place in the backdrop of the war itself. The 10th, the public debt must be kept inviolate. And for this purpose, we recommend a vigorous and just system of taxation. The Civil War is extraordinarily costly, not just in terms of lives, but in terms of dollars and cents. And as a result of that, we're going to see the first income tax in American history. And the National Union Party, the Republican Party, realizes that they need to address this, that there are increasingly high costs to soldiers' families, increasingly high costs to pieces of property damage in loyal states especially. This war is getting ever more expensive. And finally, the 11th point, looking at the United States globally, the US can never regard with indifference the attempt of any European power to supplant by fraud the institutions of any Republican government. No foreign interference is what they're asking for here, because our American Civil War is embroiled in discussions of how will the British respond? How will the French respond? How will the Russians respond? Lincoln deals with that matter for a time. And so we can certainly see that they are concerned about how the United States is being viewed internationally, not just nationally. Now, Lincoln is at the top of the ticket, but that's far from a foregone conclusion when he enters the convention. Sam and Chase have been rumored to be pining for the presidency. Lincoln's Treasury Secretary on the left-hand side there. It's going to be a big rivalry. He'll end up becoming Chief Justice of the United States, but he is rumored to be someone who could replace Lincoln at the top of the Republican ticket. John C. Fremont, who is the second man from the left-hand side, United States Army General, who had been the Republican Party's first candidate back in 1856 for the presidency. A lot of people, especially abolitionists, anti-slavery advocates, they want him to be the guy at the top of the ticket. The third man from the left there, General Benjamin Butler, is a Democrat, but a lot of people, especially in the abolitionist wing of the Republican Party, are in favor of making him the candidate, because it was he who, at the beginning of the war, was responsible for determining this idea of contraband of war for enslaved people, bringing them into United States Army lines. This is going to end up leading Congress to pass the Confiscation Act and end up with Lincoln issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. It's a series of events that largely all begins with Benjamin Butler within the first year of the war. He's another rumored but controversial figure. And of course, this man, who will eventually be on the ticket 4 years later, Ulysses S. Grant, who in 1864, and for that matter, even when he really runs in 1868, has almost no interest in becoming the Republican candidate for president. Especially in this case, he is very much in favor of how Lincoln is prosecuting the war, sees it as being a detriment if he were to leave the battlefield and pursue political office. But as we know, none of these happen, and Lincoln ends up being the man. But Lincoln's number two is going to switch from Hannibal Hamlin from Maine, who was Lincoln's vice president throughout the first term, to Andrew Johnson, a senator from Tennessee, the only United States senator who was from a seceded state who did not secede with his state, stays loyal to the Union. But as we know, in the aftermath of Lincoln's assassination, which no one could have known yet was going to happen, many will see this in hindsight, including historians today, as Lincoln's greatest political mistake, is the fact that he made this man his vice president, which ended up becoming, who ended up becoming 17th president of the United States. But it's a political calculation. This new Union Party bringing together some Democrats, especially from the South, bringing together moderates, former Whigs, bringing them into the Republican Party fold. These are all people who support the Union, regardless of how they feel about slavery, emancipation, and the prosecution of the war. And that's how we end up with Andrew Johnson as the second man on the ticket, who ends up becoming president not that long after. This is an era of political cartoons, just as we see throughout the course of American history. A few examples of them here. This one up here is a pro-McClellan Democratic one. We have Jefferson Davis, president of the Confederacy, and Abraham Lincoln over here, pulling apart each side of this map, ripping the country apart. And here's George McClellan coming to save the day. This might be my favorite of these. It's a famous Lincoln line. This reminds me of a little joke. And it's Lincoln holding a little George McClellan, little Mac there. The joke being, of course, McClellan in this case. These are some of the funny ones that we'll see, the more humorous ones. There are also going to be some really dark op-eds and poems and attempts at humor on the front pages of newspapers across the country. This one comes from Iowa, and we can see frequent use of the N-word just on the front pages of newspapers. These are pro-democratic papers, anti-Lincoln papers, anti-abolition and emancipation papers. This is up to that point in American history. We could probably fairly say the most white supremacist election until the Reconstruction era elections. And they get even worse in 68 and 72 and 76 for that matter. But 1864, we see a lot of this sort of language. We see frequent references calling Lincoln King Africanus the First, King of the Africans, as the saying went. Miscegenation is the term that is thrown around. That it was the goal of Lincoln and the Republican Party to have a term that they threw around, orgies of white and black residents of the United States together. There are all of these claims of people saying, I saw black people on the lawn of the White House. This can't stand. We see a lot of op-eds along those lines. And extraordinarily white supremacist, even more than the average election of the mid-19th century. We can see that written all over it. But we're going to see throughout the course of that summer a really contemplative Lincoln. A Lincoln who was receiving a lot of letters from people asking him, especially old friends of his from Illinois and Indiana, asking him just drop emancipation, drop abolition. Don't make any promises to formerly enslaved people. When the war is over, return them to slavery if you have to. Do what you can to end the war. Emancipation Proclamation was fine. Abolition permanently is a step too far. And one after another, Lincoln writes these letters, some publicly, some privately, where he is going to say things like, if I had to look at the warriors of Olustee and Port Hudson and Milliken's Bend, to name a few examples of places where black troops had served, he says, if I were to look at them and tell them that I was going to return them to slavery at the end of this war, I would be damned in time and eternity for so doing. That's one side, the moral side. But he also looks at the effort to win the war. And he says on another occasion in one of these 1864 letters, he says, I have used the abolition lever better than anybody has to this point. It has given us 200,000 able-bodied men, referring, of course, to the United States colored troops, 200,000 of them who had joined the federal military. He says it will give us more yet, looking to the future. So time and again, Lincoln is becoming rather disparaged by the fact that even his friends, even members of the Republican Party, are not in favor of this platform. And increasingly, he feels as though this is writing on the wall that he is not going to be reelected. During all of this, he has a meeting with Frederick Douglass. It's the second time that the two had met out of 3 known meetings between the two. Lincoln is so overwhelmed by all of this negativity about what to do with the slavery question that he invites Douglass to the White House. The first meeting had been about a year earlier when Douglass just waited in line, went in as any office seeker would, and had a discussion with Lincoln about fair treatment of black prisoners of war, equal pay for black U.S. soldiers. On this occasion, Douglass tells us years later that what Lincoln invited him to do was to go into the South before the election and take as many enslaved people as he could off of plantations, do so quietly. And he says to do so somewhat after the original plan of John Brown. So to funnel enslaved people out of the South, because Lincoln is so convinced that he's going to lose election. And if he loses his re-election bid, that means that those enslaved people have no chance at freedom, because the policy of the McClellan administration would be to leave slavery intact. The Union as it was, what's the saying? The Union as it is, Constitution as it is, Union as it was. So keep everything intact, go back to what it was before the war. So Lincoln is going to some amazing lengths here, including inviting Frederick Douglass to do sort of a non-violent version of what John Brown did. And as all this is happening, of course, there's a lot of violence happening across the American landscape. The campaigns around Richmond and Petersburg, as we alluded to already, Jubal early with Confederate forces moving to the outskirts of Washington, D.C., leading to the Battle of Monocacy on July 9th, 1864, and just after the Battle of Fort Stevens and the defenses of Washington, where Lincoln comes under fire, the only sitting U.S. president in American history to be under fire in the midst of a military engagement. And then nearby in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, the burning of that city on July 30th, 1864, the very same day that the Battle of the Crater is taking place around Petersburg, Virginia. All of these things negative for the federal military, or at least putting them in a bad light, like Early's advance upon Washington. Nothing is going Lincoln's way on the battlefield. And so in August, Lincoln is going to issue what we now call the blind memorandum, where members of his cabinet are asked to sign the rear of this piece of paper without knowing, it seems, what is on the front side of it. And what it essentially says is that Lincoln is asking them all to sign this document so that if they should lose the election, as it appears they are going to, that during the lame duck period between the election in November and the administration of McClellan coming about in March of 1865, that they would do everything in their power to work with the incoming administration to ensure that there was a smooth transition of power from one party to the other, from one president to the other, to ensure that the fruits of this war, even though they're not going to be completely resolved the way that the Lincoln administration would hope that they might, that they can at least come out of this knowing that there's going to be not only a free and fair election, but there's going to be a peaceful transfer of power in the middle of a civil war. This is the moment at which Lincoln puts country above party and self more than any other, I would argue, during the course of this entire electoral campaign. It happens in August 1864, when he thinks that there is no chance in the world that he's going to achieve re-election. Last thing we'll mention here before we talk about the actual results of the election itself, and I do want to make a brief note on how it is affected here in York. The Democratic Party platform, which is a shorter platform. Their convention takes place in Chicago from August 29th to 31st. It's only 6 tenets long. Touch on them very briefly here. We will adhere with unswerving fidelity to the Union under the Constitution of the United States. It's telling the Democratic Party felt its very first tenet of its platform had to be, we are loyal to the United States. Because that is something that the Democratic Party is being accused of, that it is not loyal to the United States. That term copperheads, of course, is thrown about during the course of the Civil War. There is this idea that if you are anti-Lincoln, anti-Republican, anti-Union, National Union Party, that you are against the Union, against the United States. And the Democratic Party is doing what it can to try to save some face with making its very first tenet, we are loyal to the Constitution. The second is that 4 years of failure to restore the Union by the experiment of war demand that immediate efforts be made for a cessation of hostilities. It's this tenet especially, I would argue, that George McClellan has the biggest hang-up on. And in fact, it's not that uncommon for candidates to not be at the conventions. Neither Lincoln nor McClellan are at their convention. But it takes days for McClellan to accept the nomination. I think it's this point in particular, for reasons we've already laid out. How could he, as the general-in-chief of all the armies a couple of years earlier, accept a party platform that says the war is an abject failure? The third, direct interference of the military authorities of the United States in recent elections was a shameful violation. The midterm elections, and to an extent this election, the presidential election, are filled with all of these constitutional questions. Who is eligible to vote? What about Unionists, loyal Unionists in Confederate states? Where will votes be counted? There had been rumors of interference by this point in time, and so they're calling that out directly. I'm not going to go much into this, but we see this happen in places like Louisiana and Tennessee in 1864, where a lot of people vote and their votes aren't counted because the laws of their states remain intact with the federal government, but their state governments had declared that they were not part of that union any longer, and that creates a really big constitutional question and crisis. The fourth, preserve the federal union and the rights of the states unimpaired. It's important that they make a states' rights argument here. That's going to be something that the Democratic Party is especially focused on, and it felt as though the federal authority, Lincoln administration especially, had usurped states' powers. The fifth tenet is shameful disregard of prisoners of war in a suffering condition, deserving the severest reprobation. Again, it's the only tenet that both parties have. We have to take care of our prisoners of war. But it's noteworthy that the Democratic Party does not mention specifically Black prisoners of war, that they would be treated fairly regardless of color, the way that the Union Party had. And finally, sympathy is heartily and earnestly extended to the soldiery. So I suppose there are 2 points we could say are the same. We have to defend the soldiers. In a rapid series of events, successive events, we're going to see military successes for the Union military all across the country. The fall of Atlanta, going to be perhaps the most famous of them. We're also going to see the victory of U.S. naval forces at Mobile Bay, Alabama. We're going to see victories in the Shenandoah Valley, places like Cedar Creek, one after another. The last part of the summer into the fall suddenly is going Lincoln's favor. George McClellan is finally going to accept the party's nomination on September 8th. So it's 2 weeks, almost 2 weeks after the party's nominating convention, where he is going to accept the nomination. I won't read the entirety of it there, but it's a pretty lengthy speech that he would have given if he were in person, but he writes it. It's printed all over the United States in syndication. We're going to see the first examples, really, of presidential polling. Say what we will about presidential polling. It's going to really sort of start with John Hay and John Nicholson, Lincoln's private secretaries. If we look throughout the collected works of Lincoln, we can see that There are several moments when they're just on trains, they're on train cars, and they're going up and down the aisles and they're asking people who they're going to vote for. There's one case where they're going from Harrisburg to Philadelphia, Harrisburg to Pittsburgh, or vice versa. And they're pretty accurate. The percentages are just about on par with where we see Pennsylvania ultimately vote. So it's interesting in a non-official way. We can see some of the origins of presidential polling. And we're going to see a lot of candidate endorsements. Now, that's something we've seen throughout American history. But this is one of the first times we see really big influential names of people who will sway people from one side or the other, including Frederick Douglass, who really is on board with the Lincoln administration, especially after the Emancipation Proclamation. But Douglass always has this question of how far will Lincoln go? Will he really continue with this policy after the war is over? And he's convinced that he will, in large part due to that meeting that he had with him a few months earlier. This piece, I won't read it all, but this is a excerpt from an op-ed that Douglass prints in the Liberator, the famous abolitionist paper run by William Lloyd Garrison in Massachusetts. And he's saying all hesitation ought to cease. Anybody who's on the fence, just as I was, don't be. Support Lincoln. I am. I think that we should vote, especially given the alternative of slavery in this country. We don't know what that will look like under a McClellan ticket. Victory at Cedar Creek, I mentioned, is going to take place in the Shenandoah Valley in October. So coming right up on the election itself, these Union military victories are extraordinarily significant for Lincoln's reelection chances. And this idea of chasing the soldier vote. Lincoln thinks that this is going to be a vulnerable position for him. These men were formerly commanded, many of them, by George McClellan. They've seen him on the battlefield. And he thinks that this is going to be the hardest group of people in the electorate to convince. There's also going to be this big question, the first time in American history, where we see a large amount of mail-in voting taking place because these soldiers are on the battlefield. And so there's a lot of questions about how safe will this be? How secure will this be? Will soldiers be influenced or swayed because those around them in their regiment are voting one way and they're going to be swayed to vote that way? How accurate will the count be? But it goes over remarkably well, and Lincoln ends up earning about 3/4 of the soldier vote, much to his pleasant surprise. A lot of political advertisements in the form of posters, such as we'll see here. I haven't mentioned his name, but George Pendleton is McClellan's running mate. He's a Democratic congressman from Ohio. We'll see some buttons and pins, these banners, waysides here, flags will be commonplace. These huge banners would have been on places like the sides of courthouses and taverns. These are similar to like a wall-size map, these massive, several feet tall banners. And election day then will come on November 8th, 1864. And it's overwhelmingly a Lincoln victory. So this is the popular vote by county. It's a little tighter on the popular vote than it is on the electoral count. Lincoln wins about 55% of the popular votes. He wins by about a 10-point margin. Of course, that's quite different than 4 years earlier, when the vote is split 4 ways by both a Northern and Southern Democratic Party in 1860, plus a Constitutional Union Party, plus Lincoln, where he's going to win the plurality, but not the majority. In 1864, we're going to see a more straightforward victory, and there's the Electoral College count. McClellan picks up 3 states, his home state of New Jersey, he picks up Delaware, and he picks up Kentucky, but otherwise it's a widespread victory for Lincoln. 212-21 is going to be the ultimate victory. For those curious, you needed in 1860 152 electoral votes. Because of the Confederate states having declared their secession from the Union, the minimum is 118 in 1864. Lincoln earned 180 in 1860 and 212, as I mentioned here. My favorite quotation that gives us a sense of what this victory meant was the title that I chose for this evening. Comes from Horace Greeley, famous editor of the New York Tribune, who writes, "We hold that the people have just decided the nation shall live and slavery shall die, so much and no more." And this gives us a oversimplification, but by this point in time, it's not that much oversimplifying. That is basically what the American people have decided. Now, the last point that I will mention here is, how does the election go in York? York at this point in time has 2 main newspapers, plus a soldier's newspaper, which is interesting. It's published out of the York General Hospital and Common. It's really confusing because the Republican paper is called the True Democrat, and the Democratic paper is the York Gazette. There's nothing particularly noteworthy or unusual about these papers' compared to any other small town, relatively speaking, small town newspapers across the United States. Anytime you look at any of these towns that have a Democratic paper and a Republican paper, it's a great microcosm of the same types of op-eds that are taking place across the country as a whole. The Republican paper is going to support Lincoln, the Democratic paper is going to support McClellan. It's pretty much standard fare. But York has this interesting addition to that. It's a temporary newspaper called the Cartridge Box. And this is completely published by wounded soldiers who are in the York General Hospital. And just want to read an excerpt from what they write on November 5th, because though they endorse Lincoln, there's a great nuance to this about just what the election meant. And we can think about this in terms of how it affects the people of York, soldiers who are wounded in a hospital, and just overall, how these men who are fighting this war that is going to go on because of the results of this election, how they're thinking about it. And also, they're sort of speaking to us, I think. The election on next Tuesday will be the most important ever held in the country, as we talked about at the beginning. It will not only decide our fate as a people for the next 4 years, but in all human probability for all time to come. It will, in our opinion, determine the question whether the form of government under which we have so long lived and prospered shall continue in the future, or whether the nation shall be divided and become subject to different conflicting forms with all their attendant evils, dangers, and disadvantages. It, therefore, becomes our duty to meet this question calmly and deliberately, to lay aside all party feeling and prejudice, and look it full in the face. For the generations of mankind, both present and to come, will hold us to a strict and fearful accountability in its decision. No matter who you are supporting, go vote, they're essentially saying. The candidates of the two parties are now before the country, with all their antecedents thoroughly canvassed and well understood. Their respective platforms have been published to the world, as we've seen tonight, and among the great masses of people have been carefully read and studied. It is not the support of Abraham Lincoln as a man, or George B. McClellan as a man, which ought to make up the difference of opinion of Tuesday next. Men are nothing compared with principle. Abraham Lincoln, with his sound honesty, his pure and undotted character, and the record of his blameless life, merely could not save a country if the people had nothing more to depend upon than these. It's clearly an endorsement of Lincoln, but they're saying these alone can't save the country. George B. McClellan, even, were all his friends claimed for him. Brave and patriotic, wise and sagacious, strong and consistent in his devotion to the government, could not save it. It must be saved, if saved at all, by the devotion of the people, not by men, but by principle. That principle must reside in the executives, the wisdom of war, of our men in council, and the valor of our soldiers in the field. So it's incumbent upon everyone, say these soldiers, in this rather unique example we have of a newspaper from 19th century York County. This is how they'll cover in York in the Republican paper, the True Democrat, victory, victory. We see a common trend. York does this in the Gazette as well as other papers. It happens in Gettysburg in the Compiler, where a lot of these South Central Pennsylvania counties lean conservative, lean Democrat. And so they're not going to say, oh no, we lost the election. They're going to say George McClellan won this county. And they're going to really hype that up. They're going to find the positive spin on the news story that they can. And they give us, I know you can't really read this from where you are, but a full accounting for all of the wards in York Borough, now York City. These are both papers, and they are consistent. They're relying on the same information, and they both trust it. And then these are all the other municipalities around York County. To make some sense of that, let's take a look here. York Borough, so modern York City. In 1860, the three candidates against whom Lincoln ran earned 54% of the vote, Lincoln 46%. Pretty much the borough of York, it has a little bit of a gain for the Democratic candidate here in the form of McClellan. Lincoln does pick up some votes, but he loses a percentage. York County as a whole, we see go even more Democratic than it did in 1860. And this is interesting to me because when we think about what York had endured, it had seen Confederate forces come through, and it actually gains support for the man who many would say is more sympathetic to Confederates than was Lincoln. So York is an extraordinarily fascinating case study in that regard, where we can see, the three candidates against whom Lincoln ran in 1860, 56%, McClellan gains 7% on that. And Lincoln is going to lose 7% of the vote. He actually loses votes. So there are hypothetically people who voted for him in 1860 who have voted against him in 1864. So I think that's just an interesting little case study there. And then beyond this, of course, Lincoln is going to be reelected as we've established, inaugurated March 4th, 1865, with one of the greatest speeches in American history, the greatest inaugural address, many would agree, and is assassinated just 6 weeks later, and doesn't have much of a future beyond this election of 1864. George McClellan is going to go on to a rather successful career of his own, governor of New Jersey. He's ultimately going to die in 1885, so he lives for 20 years after the American Civil War. Has a highly influential memoir that is not published until 1887, 2 years posthumously after his death. And here we, of course, can see the funeral train nearby in Harrisburg, the closest that we can see that it comes to us here. I'll leave the last word with a few people who thought about this in the context of Lincoln's death and the aftermath of this election. In the York Gazette, so I'm going to read one excerpt from each of the newspapers here in New York. The York Gazette will point directly to the fact that even though it had opposed Lincoln in the recent election, the most important fact of all is that his death is an awful thing for the country, and that it was he who was the choice of the people of the Republic. It accepts the results, and that's a theme we see over and over again. Is during the Civil War, this is a moment, if ever, that we're not going to accept the results of an election. This was it. Everybody did. These unparalleled crimes, says the Gazette, in the history of our country are well calculated to paralyze the people and fill the land with sorrow. The chief magistrate of the country, the chosen servant of the people, struck down in the prime of life just at this critical period when all lovers of their country were looking to him for a restoration of honorable peace and the Union, when the clouds that so long darkened our national pathway were about to vanish, and the sun of peace promised to rise upon us with healing in its wings. It is a crime that cannot be estimated, and a national calamity sufficient to weigh down the heart of the nation with unspeakable sorrow. The true Democrat, of course, had supported Lincoln, had been on board with the administration through the election of 1864. It looks to the future, and it takes on a theme that, though something has been lost by the assassination of Lincoln, we have to look to the future for what has been saved as a result of his reelection and as a result of the results of this war. The country will feel the loss of their able chief at this terrible crisis of our affairs, says the true Democrat. God grant that it may not lead to a prolongation of a war and to a multiplication of the evils under which we have so long suffered. There's a mystery, a moral here. This is the part where they're sort of speaking to us. The president is dead, but the life of the state has thus far been spared. So may we hope the mild, wholesome, free, and enlightened principles of government, which Lincoln inaugurated instead of dying with him, may survive, grow in strength, beauty, and power as the years roll by until they fill not only our country, but the nations of the earth with silent wonder and enduring admiration. That's how it's reflected upon in New York when Lincoln is struck down by an assassin's bullet. I'll give the last word to Lincoln himself, because this is another one of those cases where he's sort of speaking to us about the weight of his moment and for all time in ours. This is November 10th, 1864, 2 days after the election. He's responding to a serenade at the White House, comes out and greets people, and he says this in part: "This election was a necessity. We cannot have free government without elections. And if the rebellion could force us to forego or postpone a national election, it might fairly claim to have already conquered and ruined us. We have demonstrated that a people's government can sustain a national election in the midst of a great civil war. Until now, it has not been known to the world that this was a possibility. It also shows us how sound and how strong we still are. It shows that, even among candidates of the same party, he who is most devoted to the Union and most opposed to treason can receive most of the people's votes. Gold is good, but living, brave, patriotic men are better than gold. Now that the election is over, may not all, having a common interest, reunite in a common effort to save our common country." Thank you. Gone a little past my time. Apologies for that, but happy to take any questions if we have time for them. Put several things up here that we have coming up at Seminary Ridge, including this Friday, just in a couple of days here. We have a special Meet the Collectors event, as well as some other programs coming up throughout May and June. And as I mentioned, some flyers up here on the table if you'd like to take anything or sign up for our email list. We have that sign up sheet here as well. Bill.
It's not a question, it's just a comment. I
Sure.
was in Norway on vacation a few weeks ago. And friends that we have there took my wife and I to a park in Oslo. And there was a monument to Abraham Lincoln. There was a plaque on one side that said it was a gift from the people of North Dakota to the people of Norway, 1914. And the plaque on the other side said that government of the people, by the people, for the people, should not perish from the earth. I did not expect that, but that's the global effect that Abraham Lincoln must have had.
Absolutely. Yeah. And of course, any sort of martyr figure going down when he does will achieve that status. But we can also see that even in the midst of the Civil War itself, even especially during the campaign season of 1864 and into 65, we can see op-ed after op-ed internationally saying there's something significant happening in America with this man. And there's a great couple of op-eds, if anybody is interested in that sort of line of thinking. They're written by an American, they're written by W.E.B. Du Bois, but I think they get to the heart of this. In 1922, it's when the Lincoln Memorial goes up. Du Bois writes 2 op-eds talking about Lincoln and talking about him as the man, and how we have to make sure that we keep in mind that sometimes our historical figures have feet of clay or something along those lines, and has faults and foibles, but how significant they are in the grand scheme of not just our country but internationally. And I think that goes to that. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. It's amazing.
2 comments. I noticed, I bet, if we look back at the election of 1860 versus 1864, Republicans met in Chicago in 1860, Democrats in Baltimore in 1860, and they flipped. Yeah. And then also, I had a quote that came to mind when we were speaking here about whether they should drop the Emancipation Proclamation. In a letter that Lincoln wrote in August 1863, he said, "You say you will not fight to free Negroes. Some of them seem willing to fight for you. But no matter, fight you then exclusively to save the Union. I issue the proclamation on purpose to aid you in saving. Whenever you shall have conquered all resistance to the Union, I shall urge you to continue fighting. There'll be an apt time then for you to declare you will not fight to free Negroes."
There's like one almost perfectly per year we see this one big bold public letter that Lincoln intentionally puts in the press, and that's the one at 63 that really is the heart of that. Thank you for that.
When researching this topic last night, I was really amazed to read how many times I read where Abraham Lincoln really expected to lose the re-election in 1964, when in reality he wins by such a landslide, both popular and electoral vote. So why was he having such bad vibes, other than the fact that he was doing very poorly in the war before the surrender of Atlanta and the battle with Cedar Creek?
That pretty much sums it up. As goes the Union armies, so goes the Lincoln administration. They're so tied, 1-to-1 almost. It's interesting because if we look back at the other reason, this caveat I should say, that he has a reason to think negatively is because the midterms of 62 and 63 for that matter, because the gubernatorial elections happened in the off year in some states in 63. It's not quite as midterm as it is today, that they all take place the same year, but they go miserably for the Republican Party. It's a classic case, and we see that even in our own time. Whoever wins the presidency 2 years later loses the House or the Senate or both. The exact, I think it's 23 seats if memory serves, and the majority of the Republicans lose in 62, lose several governorships in 62 and 63. So politically, that's why Lincoln feels as though it's such negative vibes, because though there had been this peak for the U.S. military at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, it happened at, politically speaking, sort of an inopportune time, if you will. That sounds very self-serving but from a political point of view, if a Gettysburg or a Vicksburg had happened in July of 64, then Lincoln, for all intents and purposes, has probably not much to worry about for the duration of that year. But it's everything to do with this absolute stalemate of these armies around Petersburg. And And then suddenly it's one after another. Sherman at Atlanta, Farragut at Mobile, Sheridan at Cedar Creek. It's just these victories all really help him, and it lifts up the administration. People see the war is worth it if it can be won.
Question online.
Sure.
Do you think McClellan really would have stopped the war and looked for peace with the South?
Probably, and to go to the point from earlier, I think even if it's not in his heart of hearts, he would have been convinced to. I think that, obviously it's dangerous to do what ifs, but I think that more than most presidents, McClellan very well could have been more of a figurehead president, because he would have been so persuaded by cabinet members or party bosses. He doesn't really have a political ideology of his own. Everything that's put forth, and this is common of the era, that you sort of follow whatever the platform is, but he very much is sort of an afterthought in the platform of the Democratic Party. And so I would say that he feels as though the war is worth it and can be won, but not the way that the Lincoln administration was prosecuting it. But the people who run the Republican Party, or the Democratic Party, excuse me, they would have wanted to reach a peace negotiation.
I noticed in one of the newspaper articles that it had Vallandigham as Secretary of War.
Oh, I didn't catch that.
On the Democratic ticket. So, one, to kind of further your point, is he going to be swayed by the people that he puts in his cabinet? But second, I was going to ask how true was that? Like, he would have been, but
I don't know.
Yeah.
That's a good. I'll have to look into that. Yeah, that's a great point. Interesting. Yeah, I didn't catch that.
Also with the soldier vote, do you think that the Democratic platform saying the war was a failure helped sway the soldiers to vote for Lincoln instead of McClellan?
I think it had to. I think it's a combination of that, and one of these men was your general in chief for a year. The other one has been commander in chief for nearly 4. And for so many of these soldiers, we can see this time and time again. And we can see it both in, if you go look at writings from soldiers who have seen all 4 years of the war, collection of diaries, letters, things like that. Overall soldier studies, Gary Gallagher and James McPherson, we see this time and again. The number of these soldiers who are at most radicalized by the war. Sometimes we do see guys who don't care at all about emancipation at the beginning of the war, and then they're very much in favor of it by the end of the war. It very much helps that we see a lot of these white soldiers who served with black soldiers, especially through 1864 and in the Army of the Potomac, armies around Richmond and Petersburg. They see that it's worth it, that everything that has been changed up to this point as the war is being prosecuted, even if they were reluctant defenders of it initially, they're all in on it now. But even those who think that emancipation had previously been a bridge too far, they simply see it through the line that you read, Scott, from 1863, when Lincoln says we're using this as a measure to save the Union. And a lot of the men who are literally in the field, whose every forward step is a measure to save the Union, they just think that they can't go to the conclusion of this without the man who's been in charge the whole time, changing horses midstream, as the saying went. Yep.
So just kind of practically, the soldiers' votes are counted in their county. Like, how have you done any research into like how that all people are keeping track of that? And
it seems like it, and there's some questions and accusations of it being nefarious. So practically how it happens is it's completely open vote. There's no privacy at all. It's like a roll call, basically. And so Jonathan White mentions in his book, like, how much does that, like, the vote is literal. Like, they vote 75% for Lincoln. But what we can never know is how many of those 75% who vote for Lincoln really wanted to vote for Lincoln, or how much of it is that they feel as though everybody around them is shouting Lincoln, when it's time for them to vote. Oh, well, all of my friends and brothers and cousins who are in this regiment with me just all voted for Lincoln. I can't be the odd man out. And so that's all going to be counted, by someone in the regiment, and then it's mailed back to your home county, and it's counted in the results. Is my understanding, at least, of how it goes. And even voting in person, we're voting. Of course, it's all men, predominantly white men, who are voting. If we were to, walk down to our polling place here in York, there's gonna be two jars or two buckets or two baskets that we're putting our ballot into. It's, that term, the ticket, it's literally a ticket. And you're all gonna see that I just walked up and voted for McClellan, or you walked up and voted for, like, we're all gonna see who our neighbors are voting for. You probably already know that about each other, at the time, but nothing about it is secret, which is completely contrary to that. Any other questions? If you think of any, I'll be around for the next several minutes. So, thank you again, everybody.